So my question to start out here for Marion and Bobbi, and also for Jean, we'll start with Bobbi. What is the overall vision for the low-carbon future? We've talked about the several themes here. What is it? How does it all come together into a picture of scaling up efficiency, changing the business model, addressing the challenges of energy reliability, displacing petroleum use in homes and transportation, modernizing the grid? What's the big picture vision? What does this amount to?
Oh, great. Okay, well, first of all, I think that Jean very nicely laid it out. And the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest a change, a little change in our title of our conference. I'm saying we're at the low-carbon frontier, not at the low-carbon future. Because I think that, and to me, future is nebulous, and frontier is at least we've moved a little bit further ahead. So to answer your question, I think that I'm going to be general because I think we're going to get into specifics as we go further into this conversation. I think that it's a question of technology, experience, and entrepreneurship. So if I were saying, what is it that we need to get to this new frontier, it really is those three things. And technology, to me, is a very broad concept. It's renewables and all sorts of new energy generation technologies. It's things like materials and batteries, but it's also at the customer side. So that's the first thing. I think that experience is also very important, that we're going to need to try things. We're going to have some failures, but I think that experience is part of it. And also this notion of entrepreneurship. And as we talk about the new utility model, I think that, you know, one of the factors for that model is this concept of entrepreneurship. And how does the utility integrate the notion of entrepreneurship more into its own sort of fiber? So those are the things that I would like to say. And also say that, you know, energy efficiency is our linchpin, and we need to go deeper. I think that the conundrum of smart growth is one that we really need to look at. I think alternative vehicles, renewables, and clean technology, and then to get back to my notion of entrepreneurship, is innovation. And I really can't emphasize that more.
Right. Marion, what would you?
Well, at the risk of being incredibly boring, when you said what are the three things that we need to think about, I hate to say it, but what popped into my head was rate reform, because I do think this gets to the crux of how do we work in partnership with utilities to develop the incentives that they need to do the things that we all agree are good for us all. And we talk about that in Rhode Island all the time. How do we move from NEBs to DEBs? Did I get that right? I mean, and that is a very complex economic calculus that will be transformative once we figure out, like least cost procurement, which nobody really understands what the words mean, but that has transformed the way the energy system operates, and we need to figure out, we need to work with our boring economists and figure that one out. I think that's critically important and complicated, and we'll need that square NEEP pool table to be engaged in it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just use this.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, the only thing I'll do is just underscore something that both of you said, and that is this notion that if we're really looking for innovation, if we're looking for rate reform, if we're looking for ways to free up the utilities to be more entrepreneurial, to act in ways that are in the public interest, then it must necessarily start with a recognition that the people who sit at the utility leadership table, these are savvy business people. For the rest of us in the room, and trust me, I know this, the rest of us in the room, we like to say, well, the utility people, you know, they're not really innovative, they're this, which is true. If you look at the ties we wear when we're in the utility space, it's pretty boring. Yours is really nice, but everyone else, not.
The fabulous Michael doesn't.
But all kidding aside, it's because in the last 100 years of regulation, the model has been that the utilities made money just by investing in infrastructure, and the only way you could disappoint earnings is to get dinged, or what we would call a disallowance in California. I don't know the vernacular out here. And that only happens if you do something differently than you did it before and before and before that. So if we want to unleash innovation, we must reward innovation. If we want a little risk-taking, then we need to make sure that as a business proposition, it's not like sending our utility leadership to Vegas to go gamble. It must be something that can be planned, can be managed, and delivered upon. That's what that industry does exceptionally well. And that's the kind of thing, again, I look at that and I say, that's doable. That's absolutely doable. So with wise regulators and all of us working together, we can help make that change.
Well, it is a big change, though,
it's huge.
Gene. And utilities make their money today, on the investments they make in the assets that perform to generate and/or deliver the power here. Sure. Of course, in the Northeast, they're also making money doing energy efficiency because there's rules that allow them to earn performance incentives, and we have decoupling that also is making sure that there's not the revenue erosion problem. So we've taken care of these issues, but we're talking about something even bigger here. We're really talking about a broader set of integrated energy services. We're talking about different kinds of investments. We're talking about taking some risks that we haven't for innovation. So if that's part of the vision going forward, what's the roadmap to get there? How do we navigate this change? If we do it, we saw restructuring back in the 1990s, and when things were sort of beginning to shift, nobody knew what to. Things kind of got frozen. We didn't take risks. We actually just sort of held back. So what's the roadmap that doesn't get us, deer in the headlights? It moves people quickly to innovation. So how do we get there? Bobbi.
I think this is a very interesting question to sort of say, how do we get there? And I guess you can get there in various ways. And I've thought a lot about this. And again, we do have a regulatory compact. And maybe, and again, this is very theoretical because it's easy to say sitting up here, but we need to sort of unpack that regulatory compact and say, in this world that we're in, what works and what doesn't work. And I don't know how you do that, where you have a legal system that sort of has been built up with precedent and concepts of stranded costs. So it's a concept, and I'm not sure how you do that. I think that distributed energy is truly one way that we're beginning to unpack and is a very important part of our roadmap. And I'm thinking also what's sort of happening in Massachusetts, because another part of the roadmap is the stakeholder process. And I think that we finally are understanding that every stakeholder who is part of our world needs to feel empowered. And I think that as we've gone through our net metering conversations in Massachusetts that may or may not end up in legislation, and they're very complicated, I think that's an important roadmap, because what we're doing is we're recognizing the stakeholders and the needs of a group of stakeholders. And the interesting thing about deregulation, those of us who were there many years ago, is that it was about changing the playing field, and it was really about empowerment. And whether or not we succeeded is an issue or a question, but I think this notion that change is going to happen sort of now has become embedded in our perspective. So I'm not going to give you specifics on the roadmap. I think that 111D, I think there are a lot of forces of change, but I think that, sort of some of the things I suggested may be a portion of the roadmap. Oh, you have your own.
I have my own. I'll just say briefly, I'm going to go back to the idea that I think that a lot of this is going to happen as part of the regulatory process, which is what you said. And I think what we've seen in Rhode Island is the fruits of the partnership with the utility, where the utility worked very closely with one of the leading environmental groups in the state and with the New England Clean Energy Group that represents clean energy companies to develop a law that's being considered, I think, today or tomorrow, that would quadruple the size of our distributed generation program. And in that legislative proposal, they included some integration with energy efficiency, some geo-targeting to reduce the cost to upgrade the transmission systems, and also they put on the table the need to address the rate structure, so that as we incorporate more DG and more efficiency, how can the utility begin to recover their costs? So I thought that was a good way in the little ocean state to start to begin to address those regulatory issues. And again, this means that sets the table for all the smart people in the room and our colleagues at NEEP to say, okay, how is this going to work? How are we going to quantify NEBs and not NEBs? Yeah, NEBs.
May I just serve as a human highlighter pen here and underscore the two things that I think were not just important, but absolutely brilliant that you just heard from our other panelists. The first is the notion that it starts with the regulatory compact. For those of you who again have like real lives and don't focus on this kind of stuff, the notion of the regulatory compact is tremendously important because at the outset of creating the regulation of utilities, instead of trying to figure out the 10,001 little things you wanted to manage, we looked at what was the ultimate objective. And at that point in time, it was the electrification of America and bringing the benefits of electricity, et cetera. But that ultimate objective was also part of the process for making every other decision that came down the pike. There are those people who would argue today that the regulatory compact is eroding under new technology and changes in the market, et cetera. I would argue, quite frankly, just the opposite. It's not that the regulatory compact is eroding, it's in need of a tune-up. It needs to be changed. We have a new energy future, strike that, a new energy frontier that we need to be marching toward. And it's time for wise utility leadership and wise regulatory and policymaker leadership to come together and start to think through what that new end objective is. And I would also, if you don't mind my underscoring as well, underscore the use of the word stakeholder here. You notice when the wise regulators speak, they don't talk about interests, et cetera, they talk about stakeholders, people who have a stake in the same outcome. That's what we need to get more of, quite frankly, in every state, is that regulation needs to look at stakeholder interests aimed at an end result, and that's the way you're going to find this. It's time to move away, more toward leadership, less toward administration, more toward an ultimate end objective instead of the 10,001 little things that we can put into a standard practice manual and regulate.
I'm going to add another word here, which is a word that's very important, and you look around this room, and I think that it's something that we have to add, and that's this notion of diversity. Because what I think that, and I say diversity in all sorts of ways, because the world is more diverse in many respects. And, as we look at our energy system, need to say, what does diversity mean in terms of the energy system? And the other experience that I had is that I got very involved in an incubator at a university a number of years ago. And one of the things that struck me as truly the oldest person in the room in that incubator was that it is young people and ideas that are really the future. And I think that one of the things that we need to embrace as we look at our own culture and hierarchy is how to bring in youth and new ideas and sort of, the excitement of those, very much get it much more engaged and integrated into what we're doing. So I say that as a very important thing, this notion of diversity, however we choose to define it.
Can I just add on to that? I just want to add to that in that I remember when I was beginning to think about energy issues about 8 years ago, I read a book, and the book was written by a guy who had been in the utility industry forever, and he said, if I were advising my daughter about what to do with her future, I would tell her to go to Wall Street. Because utility and the energy industry is a stodgy, old-fashioned industry, and I think that has changed so dramatically, and I know Penny and I and Michael and I have talked a lot about the wonderful talent that we're seeing crop up at the utilities to help make the changes. So I think to the students in the room, it's a really exciting time. I know it's a big challenge for the utilities to think about as we talk about grid modernization and how do you integrate renewables. I think there's a concern about getting adequately trained young people into the pipeline. So that's a big issue that is something that we need to address.
So let me just, talk further about how we move this forward. So we have to bring more people into the room. Broad stakeholders, youth, new ideas. We need to be able to try some new things, do some innovation. So who goes first? What are really the next steps here? On the one hand, as you said, Jean, utilities need to have the rules that they can play within so they can do a great job. Rules around a big picture. So it'll be about a service model, for example. So those rules have to be created, figured out, but also the utility needs to be willing to change how it thinks and does things. And efficiency's given us a step into that. In some of the demand response, it gives us a step into that. So what do we do next, and who goes first in this dance?
May I answer this
Yes, you go
first?
first.
Okay.
I'd like you to go first.
Okay. Let me suggest, and this is going to feel and sound like a cop-out answer, but it's not. I think it's an accurate answer. There's two answers to that question. Both are equally correct. Number one, both in my practice when I was running efficiency programs and solar programs, et cetera, and when I was working with our corporate hub, looking at utility future thinking, the one thing that was abundantly clear to me is that no matter where you are or what you're doing and what kind of crisis you're facing, if you're going to sit around and wait for someone to parachute in and rescue you, we're going to wait for the regulators to come up with the right answer. We're going to wait for people to just change their minds about how they use energy. We're going to wait for this. We're going to wait for that. That's hopeless. It's not even fraught with peril. If you're sitting out, I'll use a really horrible analogy. So if we're talking about industry change here, and we can agree that the current industry, utility industry, electric utility industry, is like a leaky canoe in the middle of the lake. It's not yet underwater, but there's no trend line that shows a tremendous amount of growth for the industry if we keep doing things the same way. That tells you that there's an imperative to figure out how to paddle for shore. You got to get back on dry land. Now, if you want that to happen, though, the other thing is that you need for the regulators to make it okay. Let me express this from my old job, not my current role at ICF. From my old job, what I always found perplexing, confounding, and over a beer I might use a curse word, is when you have a meeting between utility leadership and regulatory leadership, and people say, yes, we really ought to do this, and yet the next day, if it doesn't find its way into the thinking of the staff at the utility, and just as importantly, if it doesn't find its way into the regulatory staff, which quite frankly does a lot of the work in setting the tone and the framework for what utilities can and can't do, then it's just a conversation. It's not truly directional, and it's certainly not transformational. So I'm going to say, certainly we need leadership vision at the utilities and in the regulatory community, but I'm going to suggest that unless it's communicated down to where people do the real work, unless you can bring in all the stakeholders and say, the ground rules are, we're going to move in this direction. We on the C-suite don't know the details enough to come up with the right answer. You guys are going to have to do that, and that's the people sitting in this room. But unless they have that direction, you're not going to get the right answer.
Let me just note that there is one state in the Northeast that has actually begun to take these issues on head on, and some people are saying it's brilliant, and some people are saying this is chaos, and that's New York. And in fact, we had invited New York to be in this discussion, and they're so busy providing leadership in chaos that they could not be here today to talk about this process. But what they did, and I know, Bobbi, you may be a little familiar because you're part-time New Yorker, that they gave themselves 6 months, this is at the highest level in the state, to come up with a frame, they call it New York Rev, to say how we're going to make this big change to a new utility industry and the rules for it. And I'm saying to myself, 6 months, they're going to figure this out. And I don't know that they're going to have it all figured out in 6 months. They'll probably come up with some kind of process that they can work through over time. But New York is going to charge forward, and they are going to give it a time frame to say, we got to get it done, and we're going to give it some steps through it. We'll learn more about it as they go. But I don't know, Bobbi, are you familiar with this very much?
I am familiar, but I'm going to put on my Massachusetts hat.
Yeah.
And say, and maybe when Chair Berwick comes this afternoon, that, you know, our grid modernization proceeding, we believe, is above and faster than New York. So we'll give New York some credit for catching up to Massachusetts. So,
Right.
I'll let you go there. And I'm sure you have
Well, and I have been told that we don't need it in Rhode Island because we've already done some of the reforms, which is actually true. We have some very progressive regulatory things in place in Rhode Island. There was something I wanted. Oh, one of the things that I'm worrying about as we have this conversation is I had the opportunity to sit in a national meeting with the air people, the energy regulators, and the state energy offices, and I was struck, and I think if anyone listened to the radio this morning, we're seeing the same thing about the difference between the West Coast, the East Coast, and the little pockets of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then the rest of the country, where they're much more dependent on cheap coal. And I feel like, you know, the coast can do all the talking and the changing. I mean, we are going to do that, but we really need to be working with our colleagues in Kentucky and Alabama and Mississippi to help them, you know, where there was a coal miner on NPR today who was being interviewed, and he was so sad because he's going to lose, you know, he feels like he's going to lose his job. So I feel like we have to partner with our colleagues in the middle part of the country to share some of what we're learning. I've just had to get that out there.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, unless you had anything else burning, Jean, I want to open this up now to the conversation here and the questions and comments that you may have. You all have observed that we need to make change, 100%. Began with agreement around the room, and that we're partway there. We've gotten started, but we're certainly not all the way there. So comments, questions from you all about what is the way forward? What do we need to do? How do we get there? Back here. Here comes the microphone.
Hi, good morning. I'm Maggie Downey with the Cape Light Compact. We are a public entity, and I just wanted to comment on something that has kind of been overlooked, which is this isn't just about utilities. It's about alternatives and public-private partnerships, and the utilities that actually, I think in Massachusetts, have acknowledged that and embraced it and have been very successful in taking us to the next step. So I want to put a little plug in. It isn't just about the private sector. There is an untapped wealth of public-private partnerships and opportunities. I think that we resemble that. We run the energy efficiency program on the Cape and Vineyard. We just are breaking ground and actually ribbon cutting on 28 megawatts of ground-mounted solar. We have a competitive power supply program offering. So we wouldn't be able to do that if we weren't working closely and hand with the utilities. So it's that collaboration that you talked about. Restructuring works. We're a creature of restructuring. So I just want to make sure that as we go forward that we remember it's not just about utilities, it's about that partnership, and to really recognize and to tap in the public-private partnership, because they also have the opportunity to bring capital to the table in kind of creative ways. So I just wanted to put a plug out for something that really wasn't talked about that much yet this morning.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right. And when I use the word stakeholders, that's really what I did mean, that we're not just the utility and the regulator, but it is the stakeholder, and the Cape Cod Light Compact is a great example of a stakeholder. And I want to bring up another notion on this notion of innovation. I think that, you know, as we look toward ideas, we've really got to look to the nonprofit sector to help us along the foundations, the Rockefeller Foundations, the Barr Foundation, the role, and I think that this is an interesting part of the change that we've experienced, is that there is also another group out there that doesn't have some of the same financial constraints, has a different set of interests. And I think that they're playing a role that's also significant. And I think that we need to acknowledge that also as an important way that a new stakeholder into our conversation.
And just let me not just acknowledge, but also applaud the brilliance of that observation, but by way of clarification of the way I'm looking at it, one thing is critically important to me that we all recognize and understand here. What we're all talking about, and what your comment suggests, is that this is about bringing more people to the table to get more done. Unfortunately, I think sometimes in these policy discussions, the real question starts breaking down into who should do this. And if we're really looking at hitting this brave new frontier of a low-carbon future, we can't do it by saying, well, let's take this role away from this group and give it to that group. Let's look for this group to do this part. We need to bring everyone in to get both more investment of financial resources, capital, but also intellectual resources. And that will entail bringing in everyone from local governments to nonprofits, et cetera. But I just want to make sure we don't start switching parts out.
So I think that, Jean, you also addressed something else, which is our communication problem. Which I think everyone in this room is a party to and is part of the problem as well as part of the solution. I don't know if you ever go to a party or a dinner or at a dinner party and somebody asks you what you do. I have a huge problem describing what we do, and normally people's eyes glaze over. So I have stopped trying to explain in any detail.
Why?
Because it's a non-conversation starter, and if you want to get rid of talking to a person, all you need to do is say that. But the issue really is something that I think we're all sort of part of the problem as well as part of the solution, because we really don't communicate some of the issues. Everybody understands the greenhouse gas, and all that we're doing now evokes a lot of sort of feelings on all sides. But really, change is happening in the very specific issues. And I don't think we're easily communicating that to the broader population. I think that, O-Power and a whole group of, new players in the field are helping us there, but I don't think we're there yet. And I would love to turn to the audience and sort of say, I'm sure you've all thought about the communications issues, and are there ways that we can start addressing that? Because I think that that's part of the change. And I think this group here has some of the answers.
Comments, questions from the audience on this communication? Back here.
All right, flash. Communications.
Well, I certainly agree that there's a gap between the relevant sciences and the public, and that there needs a communication bridge between the two. I do know that I'm actually a writing major at the University of Rhode Island, and I paired that major with an environmental sciences minor because I recognized that gap. And when I did that, my advisor told me that there's actually at the University of Rhode Island a committee forming a study program that pairs those two fields of study, because there is actually people recognizing that we need to bridge the gap. So I think it starts with building young students to make them recognize that this is an option, because we all have good ideas about how to bring to the public all the sciences that are existing, all the sciences that can help solve the problems. And there's a bunch of solutions in media-related fields. Every time I speak to my colleagues and my fellow students, most of us have minors or majors in public relations, in writing, in marketing, because it's an emerging field. And we use new technologies like social medias and internet-related media publication forums to connect with the public in a way that they can relate to it. We are bringing the sciences to them in their homes. We can't expect people to come to us to pay attention to federal forums because it doesn't interest them. And so we are turning what people will say is boring. When you see when you're at the dinner parties and their eyes glaze over, that's the problem. They think, oh, this is a government thing and it's not relevant to me, and their eyes glaze over. So we're spinning it, and we're using new marketing strategies to make them see that this is actually very relevant to them.
Thank you. other comments, questions, or back here?
I have, at ARPA-E, they talk about they need more national labs to help bring innovation to market faster. They'd like to turn to the labs to test the innovations. And so what I was wondering is, take some risk here, I don't know if the grid needs to affiliate with labs to help capitalize. They have the cash assets, perhaps, and bring the innovations to market in a way that they can see that would work with their business model. That's one idea. Another one is on the grid property. I don't know how it's regulated, but what else can travel on their lines or on their property so that we can communicate better regionally in some ways, technologically? And then the military. I mean, some of you know the Spiders group just did a microgrid with cybersecurity. So the Department of Defense has already leveraged dollars in that direction. So how do we leverage those dollars back into the community for microgrids locally, for example? And then I understand what she's saying about the marketing perspective. How do we get the general public involved emotionally in what can be seen as a dry science, so to speak? But I'm just wondering if there's a way to set up, for example, a trust nationally so that people can understand that the money is actually going to go somewhere if there are savings or matching funds or some sort of phenomenon so they can see it accumulating and it won't be lost in the shuffle. And then the other thing is animals. They're always such a wonderful message for people that they're going to get hurt or they're going to, sort of touch their hearts a little bit. There's a few more things, but that's sort of where I'm going.
Great. Thank you very much. Here are some challenges for, how do we support the innovation, we provide the funding, and then also how do we transfer what's being innovated and learned, to other platforms? It's a great question because I think we are siloed, and it is one of our problems. And it's partly the regulatory paradigm, how it's set up. It doesn't drive that. So do we need other funding mechanisms that allow us to try things and transfer them and build them in? You have to be able to take some risks somewhere. Otherwise, we're not going to get to where we need to do it. So great observations. And then obviously communicating that effectively. Comments from here?
Let's see. First of all, I just want to congratulate LaFleche on standing up and making a really good comment, because we certainly do see that with communication, we with the whole new tweeting and all this, the young people know how to do it, and they know how to connect with their peers, who are certainly dependent on electricity to run our lives. We all are. So thanks, LaFleche. And Ellen, Ellen is from Jamestown and a very active citizen who's deeply involved in these issues, has lots of great ideas. And I guess one thing I want to talk about is, on one hand, you challenged Grid to do more innovation amongst your own company, which is always a big issue with large corporations. How much money do you invest in R&D? And then the whole concept of disruptive technologies. Because on one hand, we're all working together. On the other hand, I remember being at a meeting with Enernoc and O-Power, sitting across the table from Tom May and Tom King, and Enernoc said, we're salivating at the opportunities that the problems in your industry brings to our new industry. So there's a lot of competition going on, which I guess then gets back to the regulatory structure. How do we set the rules of the game so that they're fair, so that they provide opportunities for innovation in a way that also builds the public good? And Ellen, I love your idea about the trust, and I always think about Norway and Alaska as two entities that have been able to mine their fossil fuel resources and then put some of the monies back into a public trust, which is probably something that we don't do often enough. And that's also a big issue with energy efficiency. A lot of companies and state entities or schools say, well, we'd love to do efficiency, but the money goes back into the general fund, and we don't get to reap our benefits, so where's the incentive for us? So that's one of the small things that we struggle with. So that's a few rambling thoughts there.
The only thing I would add is that I just want to point out that in just a few minutes' time, we came up with about 9, by my count, and I ran out of fingers, but about 9 great ideas in just a few minutes' time. And that shows you that if you, again, get the intellectual capital and the passion, quite frankly, of the people who are in this space to work on creating this new frontier and creating the new future, we can make this happen. Just don't wait for other people to stand up and do it for us.
You know, with that, let me ask everyone in the audience here, what needs to happen in the next 12 months? What would you, if you could write the rule and say, all right, I'm going to make this happen, here are the next 1 or 2 things that need to happen in the next 12 months to open this up. What is it that needs to happen? Michael.
Wait for a microphone. Yeah.
That's really a really great question, and I wanted to bring us back to scaling. One of the things we're not going to solve today, but one of the things that I would pose to everybody in this room is how can we make energy efficiency affordable for customers? You know, Jean said we need to think about changing our paradigm. The last 25 years, we've had tremendous success. In this little state of Rhode Island, right, we've invested over $120 million. In Massachusetts, 2 to 3 times that, maybe it's around 280 million, and in New York. All I know is that we have moved from millions to billions, right? And we've used the paradigm of systems benefits, right? Putting systems benefits on, so much, a quarter of a mil or a penny on every kilowatt hour and or therm sold. We can't do that anymore. We can't do that and take that to scale because it's becoming too expensive for customers, right? We're getting up to the point now where energy efficiency is doing exactly what we wanted to see to have its impact, but it's getting up into the same kind of cost that we have for distribution, right? So it brings us back to the question, how can we make energy efficiency more affordable for our customers? And what kinds of tools, what kind of financing mechanisms, if it is true, right, and we know it's all true, that when we invest in energy efficiency, we have proven through all the measurement and verification and evaluation that we can deliver that to the marketplace for 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and arguably on the supply side, it's anywhere from 10 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So why isn't the marketplace moving in that direction? It's because customers make many investments, right, in their businesses. And they recognize, we're seeing with our cities and towns, we're seeing with our business customers, our residential customers, after all these years, everybody's beginning to recognize that catalyst and that spark. Now to go to scale, how do we make it affordable? What are the financing methods? How do we engage Wall Street? How do we engage secondary markets to see, boy, 3 cents? 12 cents? There must be a financial economic model that we can create to drive energy efficiency, just like we drive many of the other imperatives that we have. So bring it back. Affordability. We probably won't solve that today, but we've got to start working on it because we can't continue the systems benefit. It took us to the level to prove the hypothesis, but it won't take us to that low carbon and that scale that we all are so aspirationally going to ensure happens by 5 o'clock this afternoon.
That's right. Great. Well, over here, one more. Great.
I would just add to that and say, in the next 12 months, how can we make energy efficiency cool? So, people buy a lot of stuff. We spend a lot of money on Apple gadgets and MacBook Airs, and I think there's a certain level of indifference towards energy efficiency. Maybe not so much on the 2 coasts, but certainly there are large parts of the country where energy efficiency is not cool at all, and I think that'll help a lot in making it mainstream.
Good point. Good point. Well, we're at pretty much just the wrap-up point here. I'm going to close by thanking our wonderful panelists and Jean for this, and I'm going to leave you with maybe a little vision of the future. We went through another big regulatory change in the 90s. Bobbi was part of that as well. That was on telecommunications. We thought it was a phone that we needed, and it turned out we needed a device, a communications device. And once we figured out the new rules for the telecommunications industry, we had a platform literally in our hands that brought to us a whole set of services and things we never knew we needed, right? And we pay a lot for them now, right? Because we really value them. I think we're at the same point in energy and energy services, and I think of the utility as the customer manager, the one who knows the customer, and I think utilities can, we'll hear some ideas later from Penny about how utilities can know their customers even more deeply and better. But in having that, knowing the customer, can we be able to bring the services and service providers to them through the utility as sort of that customer interface to bring a whole new suite of things, including new financing, new tools, and bring the power of the marketplace to bring those integrated services for distributed energy, demand response, and we won't even call them those things, right? We're going to call them things that people can relate to. And it will be cool. Yeah, there we go. So it'll be cool. And I think because it'll bring the other stakeholders into it, and we'll have a different paradigm. So the future will look very different, I think, 10 years from now, very dramatically different from what we're sitting here today. So I dare you all to imagine it and be with it. And now let's take our break. We have our exhibits and our break food over in that side over there. And be back here at 11 o'clock, and we'll begin our next round of power talks, and we'll have some more polling for you, too.